was writing my book, Barefoot Tribe, I was working on a chapter that I titled, We Will Live Simply So That We Can Share More. And as I'm working on it, I had heard of a man who is known as the storage unit king of America. His name is Jim Nuppy. And so I thought, I need to hear what his thinking was behind starting the first storage units in America. And so I tracked him down to San Francisco, called his office, got his receptionist. She said, oh, he's out of town, but I'll get back to you. But she called back and she said, he's traveling, but he said he'll talk to you. Here's his cell number. I was like, bingo. So the next day I dialed him up, and when he answered the phone, he sounded pretty groggy. And so I said, is this a good time to talk? He said, yeah, it's fine. He said, I'm in Hawaii. It's 5 a.m. right now. He said, but how can I help you? And I said, well, I heard you started the first storage units in the country. I said, tell me how that happened. He said, well, what happened is my wife and I had just gotten married. We're from the Midwest, and I wanted to go into construction. And so we moved to the San Francisco area and rented an apartment. That's all we could afford. And he said, after a few months, we realized even though we were just starting our family, we couldn't fit all our stuff in the apartment. There's no garages, the closets were small. And the longer we lived there, the more I heard other people complain about there's no storage space. In fact, in San Francisco, he said, even if you have a house, there's nowhere to put your stuff. So he said, I thought, what if I built a small warehouse, put a bunch of doors on it, divided it up, and called it self-storage and rented them out. And he said, I thought it was a brilliant idea. So he said he started talking to investors, looking for people that would help him buy the land and build the building. And when he shared the idea, people said, Jim, you're out of your mind. They said, who has that much stuff that they would need an extra space, a warehouse space to put their belongings? Plus, who's going to take their hard-earned good money and pay for this? You're crazy. It's never going to work. He said he couldn't find one investor, but he thought he was onto something. So in Alameda, California, he built his first storage unit. He said he put up a sign that said self-storage. A week later, every unit was rented out. And so he built a second one in the Bay Area, a third one, fourth one. Then he started going down the coast of California toward LA, buying small pieces of land near the freeways, and then building storage unit after storage unit until he had built thousands of them. And now, that was 1970 when he first moved out. 50 years later, think of the hundreds of millions of dollars just the land alone is worth, let alone what people have paid Jim in order to store their stuff, in order to store their junk. Some of you are thinking, I was around in 1970. Why wasn't that my idea? It should have been. Once it should have been. Well, maybe you don't know this, but in the Bible, Jesus tells a storage unit story. You think I'm making this up. So open your Bible to Luke chapter 12. And I want to start reading in verse 16. And Jesus says this. He says, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist of an abundance of possessions. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger storage units, or bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get you what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. That's Jesus' invitation, is to begin living rich toward God, isn't it? Now this story, we can look at it and we can think, well, the story is about possessions and money. And yes, it's kind of about possessions and money, but it's not just about possessions and money. It's more about a new way to live. It's about a way of living, being rich towards God, to use Jesus' language. I'll start with this first lesson I think that we see here, is that Jesus is showing us that storing up stuff is not the best investment strategy. Jesus is saying that if you store things up, it's a bad strategy because one day we're all going to die. I think Jesus may have learned this from his time in Egypt. Remember, after he was born, his parents ran away to Egypt. And in Egypt, I'm sure he saw the world's largest storage units. We call them pyramids, but they're just big storage units. And how'd that work out for the pharaohs? And I think Jesus is right that storing up stuff is a bad strategy because I've done my research on storage units. I've watched Storage Wars a few times, all right? And in Storage Wars, when they open, they'll be in like Riverside, California, San Bernardino, and they'll open up a storage unit, and what's inside? Nothing but junk. It's a bunch of old VHS tapes, a few cassettes, some Tupperware. There's always Tupperware, lots of Tupperware in there. People don't like their Tupperware. There's used clothes, there's cheap laminated furniture. You couldn't even sell at a garage sale. And then there's always a treadmill. You want to know where America's treadmills are? They're in the storage unit. And think about the logic behind that. Hey, I don't want to use this right now, but I'm going to put it away. So just in my mind, one day I'm going to get to it. But that's all that's there. Once in a while, they'll be in like La Habra, California, and they'll find a priceless Andy Warhol. And then I read the producers just salt the lockers. They put that in there because nobody in their right mind would leave that in the storage units. The storage units are full of junk. And so Jesus says, it's a bad strategy. Storing up on earth doesn't work out so well. In this series, we started this series titled Less. And last week, we talked about less hurry, more presence. And today, I want to talk about less stuff, more generosity. In other words, the less that we are willing to hold on to, the more generous we can go through life. And the thing is, if we look at our own lives, if we're honest, we have a lot of stuff. Compared to the rest of the world, especially the developing world, we have hundreds of times more. You think you don't have much, but you do. For example, listen to this. The average American home has 300,000 items. I'm not making this up. That was the LA Times. You go home and count. It'll take you days. Over the last 50 years, the average home size in America has tripled in size, but still 1 in every 10 Americans rents a storage unit. 25% of people who own homes with a two-car garage cannot park a car in their garage because they have so much stuff. In Chandler, Arizona, that number is 80%. I think I'm right about that. In our homes, we have more TVs than we do people. Every year in our country, by the way, there's about 50,000 storage unit facilities in our country. Every year, 700 new facilities are built. In Chandler, Gilbert, there's about 100 of them being built every year. I see them going up. In fact, not long ago, I saw a development going up real close to the Grove here. And I don't want to mention the name of it because that's not my point. Anyway, it was very fancy. And they called it Watermark, is what the sign said. But it looked like Italian architecture, and I thought, man, what's going to be in this development right across the street? And I pictured like French bistros, fancy restaurants and fancy boutiques, those kinds of things. And when it was done, I drove in. I thought, what is this place? I drive in, and I see what it is. It's air-conditioned storage units. And I was like, are you kidding me? The zonies, we want our stuff cooled down. We want our junk kept cool. I couldn't believe it. But that's how much we value our stuff. If we're honest, if we took an honest look at our own lives, we live in excess, don't we? Excess is when you have more than enough. Excess is when you could give something away today and you would never miss it tomorrow. Excess is when you have something you could give away today and and you wouldn't miss it tomorrow, and it's exactly what somebody else needs, maybe even to survive. A lot of us live in excess, if we're honest. I grew up in Africa. Most of you know that. The Africans, at least in most of the African villages that I've lived in and been, the Africans I would describe them as essentialists. They live with just the things that are essential to survive. They don't live in excess, it's quite the opposite. I've been in thousands of village huts. I've never seen a hut with a closet. I've never been in a hut that had a garage next to it. They don't need a garage. And in the villages in Africa, they wouldn't even know what to do with a storage unit. I learned this lesson when I was there about essentialism and just having enough, and just having the things that we need to really live with and get by with. What happened is we had been in Malawi for maybe a year and a half with my wife and our kids, and we had made a trip down to South Africa. And listen to this, we go into a South African grocery store and they had Dr. Pepper. I almost lost my mind. And so I drank Dr. Pepper the whole week we're down there. And then when I got back to Malawi, I went to the small grocery store we bought our goods. It's like the size of a 7-Eleven. And I told the store owner, I said, I know you truck your goods up from South Africa. Could you please buy some Dr. Pepper? He didn't know what it was, so I drew him a picture of the can and the Dr. Pepper on there. I needed a maroon crayon. Anyway, he got the idea. A few weeks later, I go and he says, hey, come over here, Palmer. And he shows me all the Dr. Pepper. So I buy a case. I make the mistake of telling the other staff on our campus, the Americans. They tell people at the U.S. Embassy, Americans are coming from all over the city to buy his Dr. Pepper. They clean him out, so he orders more. It was a glorious 2 months in Africa, drinking Dr. Pepper. And then after about 2 months, one of our staff went in and they're looking for the Dr. Pepper, and they asked the guy, where's the Dr. Pepper? He said, oh man, he said, you know, the Dr. Pepper, I would buy it, and then the Americans come in and they clean me out, and I have to buy it again, and then they come in and they clean me out. So I decided I'm not buying any more Dr. Pepper. And then he said this, he said, they don't need it anyway. And here's what they know in Africa. Why do we need it? It's more than enough. We're just consuming. Forget about supply and demand. You know, if somebody doesn't need it, you don't need to buy it. Excess is when we have more than enough. Here's what I think our challenge is. The challenge for all of us who have more than enough in our homes, in our bank accounts, in our lives, is to start to turn that into a blessing for others. When God gives you more than enough, then I think he gives it to us to bless somebody else. And so Jesus says this, if storing up is not the best investment strategy, then I want to say this next. He says, tidy up, eliminate the non-essentials. Look at your life and decide what are the things that are non-essentials in my life. Jesus has this non-essential conversation with a man in Luke chapter 18. By the way, open there with me, but some people say or describe Jesus as a minimalist. I think they're right. If you think about it, he would say things like, foxes have dens, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And it's true. We don't ever read of Jesus owning a house, didn't even own a camel or a donkey. He used to couch surf, staying in different people's houses. He just had enough to get by. Anyway, he's talking to a man in Luke chapter 18. The man is very successful, and he asks Jesus, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, well, keep the commandments. And he says, well, I've done that. So Jesus says this next. Then there's only one thing left to do. This is the Message Bible. Sell everything you own, give it away to the poor, and you will have riches in heaven. Then come and follow me. This was the last thing the official expected to hear. He was very rich and became terribly sad. He was holding on tight to a lot of things and not about to let them go. Do you see what's happening here? His soul was attracted to his stuff. His soul was tied to his things. And Jesus was saying, hold on loosely. Your possessions are grabbing onto your soul. And so I say, Jesus says, tidy up. All right, tidy up is not my language. That's Marie Kondo's language. If you don't know who Marie Kondo is, maybe you've been in a cave for the last couple of years. But she has a show on Netflix. She's from Japan, and she's brilliant. And she goes into people's houses, and she walks into a living room and bedrooms full of clutter, and she helps people get their life back together. I wrote down a few of my favorite lines that Marie uses in her show. She says things like, keep only those things that speak to your heart and discard all the rest. Don't you like that? Ask yourself, here's another one. Ask yourself, does this possession spark joy? or this one's on the screen. The best way to find out what we really need is to get rid of what we don't. She's brilliant. Okay, here's the last one. It's a little longer, but it's so good. It's human nature to take the easy route. Leap at storage methods that promise quick and convenient ways to remove visible clutter. Putting things away creates the illusion that the clutter problem has been solved. But sooner or later, all the storage units are full, and your life again overflows with things. How many of us are doing that, holding on to things that we don't need so much? And so my challenge this morning is to downsize, minimize, say to yourself, admit, acknowledge, okay, I have enough. At this point, I have enough stuff in my life, and now I'm going to share more. It's hard to live generously if we're holding on so tightly like this man in Jesus' story. We try to teach this lesson at the Grove at least about once a year when we have our Barefoot Sundays here. Can I see your hands if you've been to one of our Barefoot here? Okay, that's awesome. That's at least half of you. The rest of you are in for a surprise. One Sunday, we're going to show up. You're going to show up, and we're going to ask you for your shoes. I've had people start crying, but that's okay. They're just shoes. I had a guy crying over his snakeskin boots, I think it was, something like that. But it was awesome. Anyway, on Barefoot Sunday, we ask people to wear their favorite and their best shoes to church and then leave them here so we can share them with people who actually need them in Africa. Our first Barefoot Sunday, I remember getting a phone call from a young woman named Cheryl, and she says, hey, Palmer, you have me thinking about shoes. You told us to wear our favorite shoes to church. So my daughter and I, we went through our house counting all the shoes that she owns and I own. And between the two of us, we own 82 pairs of shoes. Holy Jimmy Choo sale. That's a lot of shoes going on. And then she said this. She said, Palmer, she said, I'm ashamed of how many shoes I own. She said, I want to be free of my shoes. So she said, I know I'm only supposed to give away the shoes I'm wearing, but can I bring all 82 pairs in our house and leave them on Sunday? And I said, of course you can. And then we'll bless 82 people in Africa with your shoes. Do you see how it works? And so the challenge today is to simplify and to live with less so that we can share more. I think the key to this is to learn this value of contentment. We can go through life envying others. That's one way or we can say, God, I'm content with what you've given me today, and it's enough. I made a list of what I'll call keys to generosity. I have it on the screen here. Just before we move on to our last point is this, that first of all, trust that God will give you enough, that what he gives you really is enough, and can you be content with that? Second, realize that it all belongs to God. That's one of the great lessons of the Bible, is that we are just stewards of the things that God puts in our realm to manage. Third, admit I don't need so much of what I have in my life. And then the last one is see that when I live with less, I can share more. And then finally, this morning, I want to say this. The final challenge I have is that less means that we can be more generous. And so invest in what I'm going to describe today as kingdom treasure. Jesus talks about kingdom treasure in Matthew chapter 6. You can look at it with me. He says this. He says, do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasure in heaven. Move down to verse 21. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Take a pen and underline that in your Bible. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Jesus' point is, be very careful what you treasure, because our hearts go after it. Be very careful what you invest in, because your hearts will follow that. Your treasure doesn't follow your heart follows your treasure. We started this morning with this challenge from Christ when he says, live rich toward God. I think there's a lot of people who go to church and say they know Jesus Christ, but if we're honest, a lot of people live poor towards God. and it's not the best investment strategy. Instead, the challenge is to live rich toward him. When you read the Old Testament prophets like Malachi, this is Malachi 1:8. Malachi says to the people of Israel, he says you're living poor towards God. He said, stop bringing for sacrifices your leftover animals. He says you're bringing blind and lame animals. He said, you want to give that to the governor. Then Malachi goes on in chapter 3, verse 10, he says, test God in it. God says, test me in this. Give to me. Give what I'm asking for, a tenth, a tithe of your possession, and see if I don't pour out so much blessing on you that you don't even have enough room to store it up. That's what God says. In Acts chapter 20, verse 35, Jesus says this line that most of us know well. He says, it is more blessed to give than to receive. And Jesus is right. Some of my favorite moments in all of life is when Veronica and I have had a chance to bless somebody's life. The person who has enough to bless someone else's life, you become the fortunate one. You become the blessed one. I think the soul thrives when we live generously. I made a list of something I'll call stages of generosity. And I'm going to put it on the screen here. I'm going to start with the first one. The first stage is zero giving, all right? That's like nada. That's no bueno. Nothing, I give nothing at all. Okay, maybe it's nobody here, but I thought we have to start somewhere. Hopefully it's not you, but zero, all right. Second stage of generosity is this, occasional giving. This is like if you're in church and they pass an offering bucket and you look in your wallet and you find a 5 spot, so you put that in. My friend Brett, who's a church planter in Las Vegas, he said, that's just tipping God. All right, so at least it's better. 2 is better than number 1. Number 3, project giving. This is really good. This is like disaster relief, giving to a crisis, giving to a project. I love project giving. That would be the third stage of generosity. I have a 4th stage, systematic giving. The Bible calls us to give about 10%, a tenth of what we have, to bring it to God's house and give it. This is when you're doing that. You make giving a priority. It becomes a life habit. That's systematic giving. It's very biblical, very good. But my favorite stage, the best stage of generosity, is what I'll describe as adventurous giving, or maybe even we could say dangerous giving. Have you ever given and it was so much that it scared you? You thought, how am I going to live now? How am I going to survive now? Veronica and I have had a number of those moments over the course of our lives, especially being in the church planting business. When I think of my frightening, adventurous giving moments, my favorite is when we were still meeting in a school gymnasium down the street. It was 2005, and we were running the last capital campaign we needed in order to raise the funds, $393,000, so that we could build the first phase of our campus here. And so the bank said, we need $393,000. That's what the church needs to bring. We had never run a campaign for more than $200,000. And so I got up on a Sunday morning. We had put pledge cards on everyone's seats, and I got up and I tried to inspire everybody. I talked about how incredible this was going to be. And then at the end of my message, I said, all right, I want to tell you what my pledge is going to be towards this campaign of $393,000 that we need in 12 months in order to move. I said, my pledge, our pledge, is $393,000 minus whatever you give today, whatever you pledge today. So do the math. Let's say the pledges are $200,000. That means I'm on the hook for $193,000. And I looked at my wife in like the second row, and her head is down. She's just shaking it. No, we hadn't talked about it. She's like, I can't believe he's doing this right now. And so I said it, and I meant it. I thought, like, God's gonna find a way if that's what we need to do. Well, I'll be honest, for the next 3 hours, I sweated bullets as our accountant counted all the pledge cards. Do you know what was pledged that day from your people of the Grove? More than $600,000. That's the people of the Grove for you. And anyway, yes, we did make a pledge as well. It wasn't $193,000, but it was close. Jesus challenges us, though, to live rich toward God. He says your best investment is in the kingdom of heaven on earth. Let me tell you the rest of Jim Nuppy's story, the storage king of America. When I was talking to him on the phone when he was in Hawaii, the rest of his story is after a few years in the storage unit business, he gave his life to Jesus Christ. And then he started to share a lot of what he made. And I knew about Jim Nuppy because of my friend Brett Johnson, the church planter in Las Vegas. Because Brett had moved from the Bay Area to Las Vegas with a bunch of college students to start a church. In fact, he didn't even have enough money to pay him, so he told them to get jobs at Starbucks. So they were doing that. But then they found some land that Brett wanted to build a church on. And he had plans for a building. And he said he needed $11 million. So Brett drove back to San Francisco and went to see Jim Nuppy, who he knew from his last church there. And he told Mr. Nuppy about the plans. He told him about their dream of turning Las Vegas around. And he showed him the plans for this building and the land that they could get. And he said, Jim Nuppy lent him the $11 million. And so when I saw Brett next and he's telling me the story, I said, my goodness, that's crazy. We just needed a fraction of that. Can you give me his number? He didn't give it to me right then, by the way. And I said, well, Brett, what are the terms? He said, terms? What do you mean by terms? I said, well, what's the interest rate? He said, he didn't say anything about an interest rate. I said, well, what's your amortization schedule? You know, is it 10 years? Is it amortized over 20 or even 30 years? He says, no, I don't know about that. I said, well, what's your debt curtailment? Are you paying this off in 10 years? When's it all due back? Is it in increments? What's your debt curtailment schedule? He said, Palmer, we didn't talk about any of that. In fact, I don't know if Jim wants any of the $11 million back. You see, Jim now is investing in the kingdom of heaven on earth. And he's living generously. God has blessed him, and now he's giving it away. And we may not have that much, but you probably have more than enough. And I want to invite you today to make a life commitment to begin living more generously, blessing others. When God blesses you, turn around and turn it into a blessing for somebody else. I want to end by giving you a challenge. I'm going to call it a 30-day challenge. This is your 30-day challenge. I want to invite you every day for the next 30 days to find a space in your life. It could be a closet, it could be your car, and clean it out. And it could be your desk at work. You know your desk is a mess. You know there's leftover muffins and cookies and things in there. You know you have spaces, garages that need to be cleaned out. But then I don't want you to just throw those things away. I want to invite you to turn your excess into a blessing for others. Maybe have a garage sale on your front lawn and sell everything you don't need. Maybe it means going room to room and putting more things on OfferUp, and then maybe taking that money and helping to send some of our Reconcile young adults to Haiti this summer, or help to send some of the hundreds of junior hires and high schoolers we have going to camp. Maybe help us with that. But take what you have, live with less, and start to bless others with those things. So that's your 30-day challenge. Every day, find something that you don't need and give it away and bless somebody else.